So that covers the Second Great Awakening. Now I want to spend some time looking at the Age of Reform, the Antebellum Reform movements. Now let's first begin by talking about causation. Now definitely, when you look at the Antebellum Reform period, it is clear that the Second Great Awakening was a factor in the sense that many people who believed that it was important for a person to end their life of sin and to accept Christ, many of these people, when they looked at American society, they believed that American society needed to cleanse its sins, its social ills. When they looked out, when they saw social problems, when they saw gambling and drunkenness and prostitution and dire poverty, when they saw these social ills, they believed very strongly that they needed to be addressed so that America could become the great country it was meant to be. Many leading thinkers of the day, like Lyman Beecher and Charles Finney, the great evangelist, believed very strongly that America was an exceptional country, that the Republic, America as a republic, was a new event in world history and was marking the beginning of the end, that the United States in its progress was making way for the end of the ages and the second coming of Christ. So there was a religiosity involved in pushing for reform, and in fact Charles Finney and Lyman Beecher were very prominent in a number of reform movements, such as the anti-slavery movement and the women's rights movement and temperance. They were actively involved in these movements. Now, another cause that has been cited for this antebellum reform period is that some people see it as a result of the emergence of a new kind of society, what is called Victorian society. It comes from England. Queen Victoria was the Queen of England throughout much of the mid to late 19th century. And what Victorian society saw was the emergence of a new type of society. And since England and America were very strongly linked because of common culture and language and historical background, both England and America experienced this social development. And what we see happening in Victorian society is the emergence of a commercial middle class as the new dominant class. If you look throughout history, in European history especially, not so much in American history, but the movers and shakers, the elite class had always been large landowners. And in England, for example, you had an entrenched aristocracy. The closest thing that the United States or the colonies ever had to an entrenched aristocracy would be maybe some of the first families of Virginia, some of the great slave-owning plantation families. America did not have an entrenched aristocracy to the extent that Europe did. But in both England and America, the 19th century, with the growth of the market economy, with the growth of capitalism, in both societies there emerged a very strong and vigorous middle class that was out to define itself, to establish its cultural and social hegemony, to dominate society. And this was a class of people that made their living from the new market economy, from banking, from manufacturing, from trade. And this new society was emerging as dominant, and they were determined to set their mark on the age. And now, in both America and in English Victorian society, the middle class defined itself by its morality and by its belief that through hard work and thrift and industry and through being a good moral person, being morally pure, that you could achieve success in life, and that your success was due to your individual achievement, your hard work that allowed you to move ahead. And some historians believe that this rising middle class in Victorian society, in both England and America, wanted to assert its values and impose its values on the rest of society, to make society in its image. Another ideal that the emerging middle class embraced was the ideals of the Enlightenment, the idea of scientific and technical advancement and progress. So they very much believed in those ideals as well. And some historians believe that many of the reform movements were inspired by this desire to create a society, the middle class's desire to create a society in their own image. Very closely related to this emergence of this new kind of middle class was the important role that women played in many of these social reform movements of the antebellum period. As a result of the emergence of the middle class, you had a situation where middle class women no longer had to work. For most people in 19th century America, women worked. Women worked on farms, women worked in factories, women worked washing laundry. Working class women worked. But you had a situation in the 19th century where wealthier upper class, middle class families, they had enough income where the woman would stay home while the man working as a factory owner or working in a bank would leave his home and to go to work. And increasingly among middle class families there was this belief that women's primary function was to make a home and to raise children, and that women were by nature, they were created basically to be mothers and wives, and that they possessed compassion and caring. They were more emotional, and that gave them the strength that they needed to serve as childbearers and people who would raise children. And since they were considered to be more compassionate, more caring, more empathetic than men, it was also believed that women had a role in helping the poor and helping the oppressed, that women had a role in protecting morals and protecting children. So we see a situation where many women, middle class women, who they couldn't get jobs as educated people, they couldn't get jobs as lawyers or doctors or politicians, they couldn't even vote, but middle class women could get involved in activities outside the home that involved the church or involved these societies or helping the others. So for this reason, many middle-class women, it was respectable for middle-class women to be involved in movements to help the poor and the oppressed and to help children and to protect public morality. And many women threw themselves into this activity. They couldn't become doctors, they couldn't become lawyers, but at least they could go in and work at their church or work in one of these various societies that were organized to deal with these various social problems in American society. Now, at the heart of the Antebellum Reform movement were these societies, these voluntary societies. What we see happening in America is that concerned citizens, many of course being middle class, would organize themselves into these volunteer societies to address some particular social ill. Just to give you an example, Lydia Finney was the wife of Charles Finney, the famous preacher, and she was concerned about prostitutes and wanted to reform them. So what did she do in 1834? In upstate New York, she founds an organization called the New York Female Reform Society, a volunteer organization of like-minded women whose goal was to help prostitutes change their ways and start new lives as good, upstanding, constructive women. And now there are a whole bunch of societies, and just to give you an example, Lyman Beecher was involved in a number of different volunteer societies for a number of different causes. That was the norm. Same thing with Charles Finney and his wife. For example, Lyman Beecher was involved in the American Tract Society that produced pamphlets to teach Christian morality. He was involved in the American Bible Society to publish and spread Bibles. He was one of the members of the American Sunday School Union, which was an organization dedicated to starting Sunday schools, not just in churches, but in factories and in prisons. There was a Society for the Promotion of the Sabbath, which Lyman Beecher and Charles Finney were involved in, which was an organization that was created to promote the observation of Sunday as a day of rest and a day where businesses shut up and people stayed home if they weren't going to church. But there are a whole bunch of these different reform movements. Now I'm just going to, there's too many to cover, but some of the more prominent reform movements were the Temperance Movement, the movement to establish public education, and the movement to reform asylums for the mentally ill. And of course the biggest social ill that we're going to talk about in a later lecture was slavery. Some people thought that was the biggest issue, the biggest problem that America had, but we'll talk about that later. So let's look at these issues. Let's talk about the temperance movement. See the word temperance there? Temperance movement was a movement to urge Americans to stop drinking hard liquor, and in some cases to give up drinking alcohol completely. What was going on at this particular time was that it was quite true that Americans did drink excessively in the first half of the 19th century. There was a reason why people were concerned with drunkenness and alcoholism. In an 1810 census, for example, the census showed that there were 14,000 distilleries in America in 1810, producing per year 25 million gallons of liquor. And considering that there were only 10 million Americans in 1810, that would mean that there was 2.5 gallons of liquor a year for every man, woman, and child. So that's a lot of liquor. And now, with the temperance movement, it wasn't just about that alcoholism and drunkenness went against the Bible or was immoral. There was a practical side to it. Factory owners did not like the idea of factory workers coming in intoxicated. That meant for an inefficient business. So factory owners often were the biggest supporters of the temperance movement for practical reasons. They wanted their workers not drunk or coming off of hangovers when they came to work. But other people noticed that the drunkenness and alcoholism led to other social problems. For example, people who were drunk or who were drunks or alcoholics were more prone to engage in risky behavior like gambling or prostitution. And it was also thought that drunkenness, people who were drunk, they couldn't make money, they couldn't work, they would lose their jobs, and that would mean if you were a man, you could not provide for your family. So it was believed that drunkenness led to poverty and it broke up families and destroyed families and left women and children devastated. You can see the image there that it shows the progression, how somebody just starts drinking alcohol, and next thing you know, they're a bum. And at the bottom of the picture, you can see the poor man's, presumably his wife and his daughter, on the streets because they're basically their main provider, their husband's an alcoholic and on the streets and basically has destroyed his life. So that the big concern about with the temperance movement was to stop alcoholism, but also to make an effort to address these other social problems like prostitution and poverty that were associated with alcoholism and drunkenness. Now, the first organization to deal with temperance was the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance, which was founded in 1826 by a group of clergy in Boston, Massachusetts. 7 years later, in 1833, you see that a group of organizations around the country came together and met in Philadelphia and founded the American Temperance Union. Now, the temperance movement initially decided that they were going to try to persuade the public to drink less. So they spread their message through pamphlets and giving sermons and giving speeches and having rallies. In the same way, in a lot of the same ways that the political parties that were emerging in the 1830s, like the Whigs and the Democrats, used rallies and speeches to get their message across. It's the development of volunteer associations and political parties, they parallel one another. The American Temperance Union also decided that perhaps they should work to change state laws to stop the problem of alcoholism. In 1851, through the efforts of the temperance movement, Maine became the first state to actually ban the sale of liquor. And by 1855, some 13 states, mainly in the North and New England, had passed similar laws to ban the sale of liquor. But whether or not they stopped alcoholism, that obviously they did not, because we know that people were still drinking heavily in America at this time. But they were making an effort anyway. Another major movement was the effort to reform asylums and prisons. It's important to remember that up until the early 19th century, there really weren't that many prisons. The reason for that is that most crimes that were felonies, the punishment was hanging. And lesser crimes, the punishment usually involved things like mutilation, like having your fingers cut off, your hand cut off, or being put in the stocks, where you'd be put in a stock and residents would throw things at you or verbally abuse you. And usually imprisonment was reserved for debtors, people who couldn't pay their debts. And usually if you were placed in a local prison as a debtor, your family was expected to provide for you. So if you didn't have a family, you're out of luck. But by 1830, many states had changed their constitutions or changed their laws to eliminate those types of punishments, like mutilation, or hanging was not used as much for as many crimes. One of the motivations for changing these state laws was the rise of democracy and the belief in the dignity of the common man, at least white men anyway. If you were African American, you could still be punished in these horrible ways. But by 1830, most states had changed their constitutions so that you could no longer be punished that way. But that meant that you had more and more people who were guilty of crimes being placed in prisons for the long term. But it was at this time period, and this belief of during the Second Great Awakening, during this period of this idea of repenting of your sin, that many people came to believe that prisons should be a place not just for punishment, but for repentance. That they could be a place where you could take criminals and transform them into constructive citizens. And actually, New York State led the way. In 1816, New York founded it's called the Auburn Penitentiary as a kind of a model for, it became a model for other states. The idea where you take prisoners, you subject them to harsh discipline, with the idea that, not physical discipline, very tight schedule, and you put them working in workshops. The idea that they would learn self-discipline by being subjected to this very disciplined, arduous work schedule. And this became a model for many other states over the years. But another problem you had was the problem of the mentally ill. A lot of times, mentally ill people were just, if they didn't have family to take care of them, if they committed a crime or were a public disturbance, they were just thrown in jail and just allowed to rot there. And this was changed through the efforts of a Boston school teacher named Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was a Unitarian, and in 1841, she went to teach Sunday school at a local prison, at a local asylum, and was shocked by what she saw. She was shocked by how the inhumane way in which the mentally ill were treated. And from that point onward, she was determined that she was going to change things, that she was going to help the hurt. Now, as a woman, she never married, she was a spinster, but as a woman, it was respectable in society's eyes for her as a woman to care for the downtrodden and for the poor, and for helping mentally ill people was a perfectly acceptable activity for her. So she made it her mission. And in 1843, after collecting evidence, she did an official report to the Massachusetts state legislature, where she provided evidence of the mistreatment of the mentally ill. And she made a series of recommendations so that the mentally ill could not just be thrown away and discarded, but could actually receive some kind of humane treatment and be treated well. And from that point on, she went nationwide and went to many different states, speaking to state legislatures, making recommendations about how to help the mentally ill. So that was a very important part of the reform movement. Now, another area for reform was education. It's important to remember that prior to 1830, there was no system of public education in America, with some exceptions. Most Americans were educated at home or by private tutors if they could afford them. But America did enjoy high literacy. It was probably one of the more literate countries in the world, and in the early 19th century, a lot of that had to do with primarily its Protestant faith, in the sense that it was growing. People were, because of their Protestant faith, believed it was very important to read the Bible for themselves. But the problem arose, though, that by 1830, with the growth of towns and factories, and you had a more mobile population, the fear was that these people who were working in factories, working in towns, they weren't unable to give their children a proper education. Now, the one state that was exceptional, that it did have a system of publicly funded schools, was Massachusetts. Ever since the 17th century, Massachusetts had a system of public schools per se. Ever since the days of the Puritans, it had been the law that local towns had to create a free education for local residents. And it was no coincidence that it would be from Massachusetts that it would arise the demand for reform. And one of the leaders of reform was Horace Mann. He was from Massachusetts, a lawyer by training, and he dedicated himself to that establishing nationwide a system of state-supported schools. He believed very strongly that it was necessary for young people to go to schools so that they could learn about patriotism, that they could learn proper morality. At a time when many kids were working in factories or had families, their parents were absent because they were working, he believed that these kids needed to be in school so they could learn patriotism, learn obedience to the laws, learn good morals. And Horace Mann was very successful in getting this point across. He made some reforms within Massachusetts. He established for the first time a board of education that served as a model for other states. He established the idea that teachers in the public schools needed to get a special education to train them to become teachers. He established one of the first normal schools, which was the special schools designed to teach school teachers. And many people would say that the public education movement was another example of the influence of Victorian society, where you had a middle class who saw the public schools as a way to impose their values on the rest of society. But on the other hand, it wasn't just the middle class who supported public schools. Many working families, many working people by the 1820s and 1830s had organized working men's associations, and many of these working men's associations were concerned that their kids were not learning how to read, were not getting education, and that was going to hurt their future. In fact, it was the Working Men's Association in Philadelphia in 1830 that called on the legislature of Philadelphia, of Pennsylvania, to establish a system of publicly funded schools for children. But much of the actions of Horace Mann and his work and his legacy, it's planted a seed, and it would be after the Civil War in the late 19th century where you see the flowering of the seed and the rapid growth of public schools. So that, in a nutshell, is some of with temperance, with education, with the work in asylums, those are some of the